Alright, this will hopefully be our last video on Chapter 2 of Government in America. And this one is going to be on approving, changing, and interpreting the Constitution of America. This was a very long section of the textbook, but the ideas contained within it were fairly simplistic, so I managed to condense sections 2.5, 2.6, 2.7, and 2.8 into a single notes page, and will hopefully be able to compile them similarly into a rather short review video for y'all and for myself as well. Alright, let's begin with section 2.5, the key question for which, according to me, was how did Madison balance the majority rule with minority rights? So James Madison was the primary architect of the Constitution. He was present at the convention, and he wrote a number of the Federalist Papers, which we'll talk about shortly. And his main focus in drafting the Constitution was to thwart the tyranny of the majority. So he and a lot of the other people at the convention felt that the majority tended to be poorly educated and just generally not have the needs of their rich as their priority. And so in this case, the minority they were actually defending the rights of was themselves, the elite. But it extends to other minorities as well. So Madison constructed this whole system, which we call the Madisonian System. And the main components of the system were limiting majority rule, separating powers, as Montesquieu was talking about, and using a system of checks and balances to make sure that no one branch of government had too much power. So the federal system was also a check on the national government. It's one of those that you don't talk about as much, but the fact that we are a federal republic, meaning that the power is split between the states and the national government, is an additional check on the power of the federal government. So essentially what Madison did with this system was create not so much like an absolute democracy, but a republic or a representative democracy based on the consent of the governed. So we don't vote on every last little thing, because there's just too many of us and it would take forever. Instead, we vote on the representatives who are going to vote on every thing. In general, it has been argued and supported by a lot of people that Madison's system tends to favor the status quo. The status quo. In that it is somewhat resistant to change. And some argue that it makes policy processes inefficient to an impractical extent. But I mean, we have managed to get some stuff done in the last 300 years, so maybe not too great of an extent. Alright, section 2.6. Main question, what were the views of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists? This one should be fairly simple. Basically, Federalists think, yes, we should ratify the Constitution. We like it, let's go with it. Anti-Federalists weren't so sure. So the Federalist Papers were, as the fictionalized version of Hamilton, portrayed by Lin-Manuel Miranda, once said, a series of essays anonymously published defending the documents to the public. So basically, they were 85 essays written by James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton, but published under the name Publius, and they defended the Constitution quite eloquently. The Federalists were mostly wealthy professionals, and the Anti-Federalists were mostly not. So some of the primary arguments from the Anti-Feds included that the Constitution was elitist, that it didn't enumerate our rights and therefore was depriving us of those rights, and that it weakened state powers while heightening the national economic powers to an undeserved extent. So the Federalists did a number of things, proving their political savvy in order to get this Constitution ratified. First of all, they promised to amend the Constitution later with a list of enumerated rights, which they eventually did with James Madison's Bill of Rights. And then they also decided that the Constitution needed to be ratified not by state legislatures, but by special state conventions, because they felt that the state legislators would be biased towards state rights, which were somewhat detracted by the presence of the Constitution. So this worked wonderfully, and the Constitution was finally instated in 1789 with George Washington as our president. Alright, section 2.7. The key question here is, how can the Constitution be changed, both formally and informally? Informally. Sorry, I keep ending the frame just a little bit too soon. Alright, so our framers, the constitutional framers, made it intentionally difficult for us to formally amend the United States Constitution. It has to be proposed by either Congress or by a national convention, and then it has to be ratified by either state legislatures or state conventions. Now, only once has it been ratified by state conventions instead, and that was the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition. And never have we called a national convention to amend the Constitution. It has always been Congress, but we still could, in theory. Some amendments have been proposed in Congress, but then were never ratified. The most notable example was the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, which just declared that women should have the same amount of rights as men. This flew through Congress and was ratified by several state legislatures, but it ultimately failed. Informal changes come from a bunch of different venues, primarily judicial interpretation and political practice. So in 1803, Marbury v Madison, this court case involving some midnight appointments made by John Adams to the courts right before he left the presidency and Jefferson entered it. And this case established the concept of judicial review, that the courts had the right to declare laws or executive orders and the such constitutional or unconstitutional. And this has been applied in a number of different cases for things such as abortions and segregation and essentially everything. Changing political practices have also caused changes in our body of law, including the development of the party system, which was never accounted for in the Constitution, in which our first president, George Washington, vehemently opposed, as well as changes in the role of the Electoral College. So the Electoral College was originally a series of electors who could vote basically however they wanted. And while technically they're still allowed to vote however they wanted, the expectation nowadays, due to the pervasiveness of the party system, is that whoever gains the majority of votes in a state, that is who the electors are generally going to vote for, if they are from that state. Technologies such as mass media and atomic weapons have also fundamentally changed the shape of United States government and politics. They've increased the importance of the bureaucracy as we've come up with computers, and they've also increased significance in the role of the president and the media in regards to getting stuff out there, and then also with those atomic weapons that we discussed. Increased demands for new policies, especially international ones, like with the war on terrorism, have also increased the significance of the role of the presidency. And the many ways to informally change the Constitution make the Constitution a flexible living document. So that's kind of the significance of this here. Jefferson agreed that the Constitution should be a living document. Judicial interpretations have sometimes been very strict constructionist, like we should go with exactly what the Constitution says, but I believe that was not the framers' intent. I believe that the framers' intent was to make this Constitution adaptable to changing times. Alright, our final question for the day, section 2.8. How does the Constitution affect democracy and the scope of government? The two main themes of the textbook that we are reading this year. So the Constitution created a republic, which gradually became more democratized to greater and greater extent. Some people will say that it definitely was not a democracy to begin with. I say it was just a selective representative democracy, and it has become less selective over time. People are more eligible to vote on more things than ever before in U.S. history. So that is something to be proud of if you are a fan of democracy. The Bill of Rights and the Madisonian System somewhat limit the scope of government action, but still the potential range of government action remains quite wide. So there's a large potential for it, although sometimes the processes prevent that from happening, like with gridlock. So my Cornell Notes summary for this section, the last section of Chapter 2, is as follows. James Madison played an instrumental role in the making of the Constitution, establishing his Madisonian system to thwart the tyranny of the majority and promising the Bill of Rights to sway anti-federalists and thus get the Constitution ratified. This document provided a framework for American government still in use today, but its flexibility and the many informal changes that can be made have made the system adaptable and led to an expansion of democracy overall. Thank you for your time.